Last Man, written and narrated by Chapman. I can see them watching me from the habitation dome, their faces pressed to the windows like frightened children. One of them, likely Maris, will be suiting up at this very moment, hell-bent on saving my life and becoming the hero he already believes himself to be. I chuckled to myself at that little joke and released the last of the locking pins arrayed around my helmet. My fingers open within their clumsy gloved embrace, and the bright red pin drops to the ground. It falls slowly in the 1/5 Earth gravity, sailing down like a penny dropped in a dream. The pin makes a tiny crater in the moon dust at my feet, and I smile with mounting anticipation. The crater. It all started with the crater. They have the floodlights on me now, like nervous prison guards observing a dangerous criminal in their midst. My shadow peels away into the absolute dark, stamping my body's signature on the cold desolation beyond. Their fear is understandable, I suppose. It's not every day that you get to watch a highly trained astronaut preparing to remove his helmet in hard vacuum. To their ignorant minds, what I'm about to do amounts to suicide. If only they knew the truth, the miraculous transformation I'm about to bring into fruition. My name is Eric, Commander Eric Wilson if you prefer, and along with my 5 companions, we are now famous across the length and breadth of the Earth for establishing the first permanent base on the Moon. A week ago, I was just as elated as my fellow crew members at our collective achievement. The video feeds from our smiling families, the stilted and rambling congratulations from our president, the asinine questions delivered by incompetent news correspondents. Oh, but how things have changed. In all honesty, I feel sick to my stomach when I consider what we have done. The unspeakable intrusion we have made upon this ancient tomb of a world. You see, I now recognize this gleaming assemblage of earth metals and polymers for the folly it is. This small miracle of human engineering, once beautiful to my own eyes, now appears ugly. Ugly and somehow immoral, obscene even. My former crew members sit inside their little bubble, filling it with the reek of their sweat, the fetid stink of their lungs, never really understanding the travesty they have perpetrated. They have the audacity to call it a habitation dome, when in actuality it is nothing more than a shabby tent. The radio channel crackles open, and Lydia's soothing tone once more fails to mask the terror lurking behind her words. She wants me to walk to the airlock, to come inside out of the cold. I shudder at the prospect, and abruptly close the connection for the 17th time. Her words sicken me in a way I can hardly bring myself to comprehend. If I could, I would rip the speakers out of my suit with my bare teeth, cracking plastic, pulling wires like guts from the insulated dome that surrounds my head. But never mind. Blessed silence is only moments away now. I must be patient. I must prove my worth. This is all happening because of something I found yesterday, 8 clicks from the base. There, I've said it. I've kept my discovery secret up until now because it really doesn't concern anyone else. What is more, the thing I found wouldn't like me to tell the others about it. Like me, it doesn't trust them one little bit. I've always preferred my own company, though of course I've never let that be known to the administration. They don't like loners, only team players. They fear people like me, who harbour their own ideas and aspirations, their occasional visceral hatred for the rest of mankind. Yesterday, when I was still sane, I was the sole geologist on the crew, and therefore the only member permitted to explore more than a stone's throw from the base. However, as with any mission, no matter how small or trivial, The administration takes things slowly, glacially slowly. Each sample I collected had already been pored over by countless scientists back home, their calculating eyes glued to the ultra-high resolution scans beamed back from the satellites more than a decade ago. In no way was I permitted to deviate from a schedule that had been set in stone years before I was even selected for the mission. How short-sighted they were. Here I was, an experienced geologist of 14 years, slap bang in the middle of a veritable bonanza of geological material. Was my opinion, my considered discernment in the field of operations, not worth anything? Even so, in those first days, I conducted myself professionally and did the work I was bidden like a good little boy. Using the electric trolley, I drove to each of the predetermined sites, collecting samples of rock and ink-black glass, vials of moon dust painted all the colours of a grey rainbow. I was excellent at my job, diligently photographing, bagging and stowing the various samples, filling the plastic containers in my cart like a mad bastard shopping for rocks. It was on my 7th day, yesterday in fact, that my resolve finally broke and I went off script. The betraying eyes of the satellites would alert the administration to my indiscretion, but I no longer cared. Something other than my intellectual curiosity had drawn my attention to a distant crater some 8 kilometers from my position. It was a compulsion that at first concerned me, but I soon recognized it for what it was. The growing feeling of supreme unfairness had finally tipped the balance. I knew the crater intimately from my compulsory research conducted during my 3 months in Washington. It was a site penciled for survey 12 months from now, but a survey that would be conducted without me. The injustice of the menial tasks I was charged with on this first mission was an affront to my expertise. It might sound childish to you, but I was determined to at least be the first man to set foot upon its virgin powder. At the same time, I couldn't ignore the dull throbbing hum that hid behind the silence whenever my head turned to the west. I thought at first I was imagining it, that it was some obscure magnetic disturbance unsettling my paranoid radio unit. Only now do I understand the truth of the matter. I was being called, led to the stable as a goat by a rope. From where I sat in my trolley, the crater looked perhaps only a kilometre away. But of course, the eyes are easily deceived in the absence of atmosphere. I made my calculations, and if I was careful, I would have just enough power and oxygen to visit the crater and return safely. Even so, it was a gamble, what the administration would consider utterly unacceptable. I imagined dozens of scientists back home shitting their collective beds when they saw what I was up to. But there was nothing they could do to stop me. I discarded my samples from the trolley and set out across the empty gulf between. The crater was an ALC, or in layman's terms, a shallow cup-shaped crater. The sort of blemishes children draw on pictures of the moon, like acne on a teenage face. I can't tell you how much I had anticipated this moment. My first direct experience of an ALC that wasn't in a textbook or ogled from internet images like an adolescent gorging on pornography. I would be the first man to leave my boot print, just as Neil had done back in '69. I parked my trolley 10 meters from the slope and congratulated myself on the calculations I had made. There was power enough to spare, and I still had an hour of oxygen remaining. If I was very lucky, the satellites would not have even noticed my deviation. Just a little climb, a little peak, and then back in time for dehydrated chicken soup. I shake myself from my recollections as the airlock suddenly opens, the plume of evacuated air hissing from the breaching door. I grin with satisfaction when I see who it is. Yes, indeed, folks, the hero of the hour. Commander Maris has finally made his appearance on this monumental stage. How he must be feeling right now, pumped up with his own self-importance, his manhood already twitching with the anticipation of this heroic act played out across television screens across the world. Even when I was sane, I detested the man. Now I feel emotions that transcend mere hatred, emotions that go light years beyond what a repressed, introverted geologist might be expected to exhibit. Let him come. Let him be the first to witness my birth. It makes me a little embarrassed to recall how I first reacted when I made my little discovery. I was terrified. I very nearly turned and ran, but these base animal instincts didn't hold sway for long. Very soon I was creeping ever closer to where it lay, my fingers itching to embrace its cold perfection. Even so, at first it was as though it was hiding from me, a shy animal curled beneath the lip of the crater's edge. But oh, how it greeted me! Movements that complemented its perfect form carried it towards me, rippling and coiling, decanting itself across the pan of dust like a gallon of fine wine. When it reached the weave of my suit, its probing edge bifurcated into a million fine filaments. The black mass eddied against my outer shell like some sleek creature lurking in a rock pool. The pressure it exerted was comforting, the sure caress of an experienced lover. It seemed to pause, and I stifled a sob that it might retreat. But I need not have worried. Those minuscule fingers each found a path inside, parting the microscopic carbon strands without a single molecule of air escaping from my suit. It might sound trite to reduce the experience to such a simple statement, but when we first touched, I felt for the first time in my life complete. For long minutes it shared the insulated interior with me, coiling and writhing against my skin, its surface smoother than an eel coated in oil. My fear returned briefly from whatever dark annex it had been hiding when it filled my mouth. There was a breathless moment when I found that I couldn't breathe, but it didn't last long. Soon its dark mass was sliding down my throat until it filled my stomach like a hearty meal. I felt ashamed when I realized what had happened, for it meant me no harm. It was just a kiss, after all. A moment of intimacy between soulmates previously separated by immeasurable distance and an eternity of time. When it left me, I felt bereft. It extruded from my suit and slithered across the icy dust from which it had come. I would have stayed with it until the last of my oxygen was bled from the tank, would have gladly died in its lustful embrace. But then the voice spoke inside my mind, and I realized it had never truly left me. We would walk out together and greet our human companions. Greet them, and then murder every last one of them. Commander Maris comes to a halt some meters away. He doesn't dare come any closer. He's far more concerned for his own skin than the quiet geologist so eagerly contemplating his imminent demise. The mirror-like sun shield evaporates from his faceplate, and I see his eyes peering at me across the airless space between us. I expect his square jaw to be firmly set, his startlingly blue eyes mocking me with their faux pity. But I'm delighted to see that he's scared. Perhaps he isn't as stupid as I thought. Perhaps he has some inkling of what is about to unfold. He takes a hesitant step forward, and my hands reach quickly for the clasp of my helmet. If I were pointing a gun to my head, my hands upon the clasp would be the finger pressed to its trigger. He freezes, his body locked rigid by indecision. His voice is heavy and breathless when it squawks from the intercom, his attempts to console me as pitiful as Lydia's. I snap the clasp to the open position, and I hear his indrawn breath. His hand reaches out in a pathetic charade of entreaty, and then promptly recoils when I abruptly lift the helmet from the seal. Like any good space cadet, I know the procedure for accidental, or in my case intentional, hard vacuum exposure. One must completely expel the air from one's lungs, or else the catastrophic change in air pressure will inflate them to destruction. Unlike the rather more absurd movies on the subject, your eyes do not instantly pop from their sockets, and nor does your body explode like a balloon popped with a pin. The damage done to exposed tissue is tremendous, but not ultimately fatal. What I have in mind, however, isn't in any of the textbooks. I feel the water in my eyes boiling, the saliva in my mouth bubbling, my face burning with a fire that is almost as cold as the laws of thermodynamics will allow, but I am still smiling. Maris looks on with dismay, the look of a man who is witnessing the impossible. Other senses guide me now, replacing the eyes that are slowly shriveling in their sockets. I can smell his fear, can almost taste the excrement now leaking from his paralyzed bowels. I should be dying now, but I know I'm quite safe. I'm changing, that's all, becoming less human, becoming more complete. Despite the absolute cold, it is not enough to entirely rob my body of its heat just yet. The seals in my suit are very devious, and try as hard as they might, in their mindless way, to preserve my life. But I reject this feeble attempt at salvation. The heat that remains seated in my vital organs repulses me, and I fight now to be rid of the suit that clings so cloyingly to my skin. Gradually, my mind clears, and I'm able to remember the clasps at my shoulders and groin. Slowly, clumsily, I shed myself of this hateful skin. Maris looks on with madness in his wide blue eyes. He's just watched a naked human body birthed onto the barren slopes of the moon and doesn't quite know how to process it. He understands without utilizing the scientific faculties of his brain that I should already be dead, or at the very least unconscious. But here I stand with my grin now frozen in place, my shriveled eyes still boiling away their precious liquid into the nothingness that surrounds us. He should have turned then and run for his life, but a part of his mind still refuses to accept what is happening. He believes I am already dead, and that my widening grin is something his frazzled mind is conjuring for his amusement. He takes a step forward and reaches for my arm, which is now puckered and swollen, the distended skin already encased in a thickening layer of ice. So intent is he on my appearance that he fails to notice what I'm holding. A piece of moon rock the size of my fist. Distantly, I reflect that in another life, another time, this would have made a fine sample for examination in the auto lab. The absurdity of this thought makes me want to laugh. My lungs are by now completely empty, but my jaw opens wide nevertheless, the groan of my freezing tendons grating upon my ears. I raise my fist, and still poor Maris only looks at my disfigured face. I can see myself reflected in his visor, and my straining jaw somehow manages to open even wider. My face is beyond recognition, my eyes now black wrinkles sitting in the tombs of their sockets. The reconfiguration of my body into its new, more perfect alignment is all but complete. The sight of my blackened skull makes my dead heart perform one last lurching beat in excitement. My fist plunges down, sending the rock shuddering into Maris's visor. A lightning bolt crack sinks its way into the plasteel, a pinprick of escaping air jetting from its apex. Maris falls in slow motion to the dusty basin, and I go with him, my grin as wide as a hole into hell. I bring the rock down again and again as the lightning bolt splinters into more complex fractal configurations. The final blow is delivered with such blinding hatred that it completely shatters what is left of the helmet's structural integrity. The air pressure inside explodes the glass outwards in a great cloud, shards of razor-sharp glass pinging off my hardened carapace of ice. Blood jets from Maris's open mouth, turning instantly to slush that pools within his helmet. He's drowning on his own icy blood, and still those boiling eyes of his register only disbelief. Now that he is dead, I no longer feel any animosity towards him. In fact, I spend 20 minutes or so carefully removing his body from his spacesuit before laying him to rest. He was undoubtedly a fine specimen of a man when he lived and breathed, but he is immeasurably more beautiful now that he reclines within his new setting. His body sways gently in a breeze that cannot be there, his fine musculature sparkling with ice as though dipped in liquid diamonds. My neck grates alarmingly upon my frozen bones, but I manage to get back to my feet. I see 4 faces quickly disappear from the viewports in the habitation pod. If they were frightened before, they are close to hysterical now. These once professional, quite frankly dull scientists have been transformed in a matter of moments into the gibbering primates their distant ancestors once were. I walk over to the dome and lazily rest my head against its thin polymer wall. I can feel the press of air beyond, distending the super tough material into a wall that might otherwise have been mistaken for steel. I can hear voices, the sound waves travelling through the fabric and into my frozen eardrums. Oh, they're scared all right, and probably a hair's breadth closer to insanity than myself. They talk of suiting up and escaping to the lifter. One of them even suggests burying Maris's body in the dust. The crazy bastard. I rap my knuckles on the wall and place my ear back where it was. I can hear a man and a woman crying, another male voice angrily commanding their silence. I wish that just for one last time my lungs could be filled with air, if only to utter my parting words in this, their moment of peril. It wouldn't have consoled them in any way, but I think it would have made the scene that followed somehow more magical, more complete. I pull the knife from its leather sheath and regard its surgical steel in the starlight. It glints pleasantly. If it had an eye of its own, it would almost certainly have winked at me companionably. We shall accomplish great things together, you and I, it seems to say. I nod my head in agreement and press its point squarely against the fabric. It's made of tough stuff, this space-age rag, but not nearly tough enough. It was designed specifically for the lunar environment, where the only thing it was supposed to repel was an errant micrometeorite or two. I must confess, it performs this function remarkably well, but alas, it isn't quite as proficient against a knife rammed home by a maniac. A tiny hole opens beneath the blade, spitting forth a violent hiss of escaping air. Blinding red light strobe from the gantry above, its accompanying wailing siren loudly proclaiming the imminent breach to those men and women now scrambling for their suits. I'm about to give the hole another little poke when I find myself scooped unceremoniously from the ground. There isn't an audible explosion, but the violent exhalation of air hammers into my chest. My head hits a boulder 20 meters away and I slump to the ground. A knock like that to the noggin would have killed a lesser man, but I'm made of stronger stuff these days. Even so, I notice that a section of my skull has detached itself from my head, its accompanying grey matter glistening like a frozen dessert sitting in a shard of coconut husk. I consider putting the broken shard and its measure of brain back inside the hole in my head, but decide upon reflection that it would be a waste of time. That fine jigsaw that once held my mind together has long since departed from this universe. Now my thoughts are stitched together by far more devious means, the cold fingers of my new maker sitting alongside my frozen remains in a steely embrace. I pick myself up and dust off my legs. I want to look presentable for my crew during their final moments after all. Jason, Karen and Serge lie gasping on the ground. They look very much like beached fish, gulping in the absolute silence. Somehow they all manage to expel the air from their lungs in time, unlike that dullard Maris. Their lungs are all ship-shape, but they are dying nonetheless. I'm so enthralled by their writhing shapes that I almost neglect to notice Lydia clumsily retreating to the south. She's wearing her suit, the clever thing. Even so, I'm in no hurry to pursue her. Instead, I sit and watch my companions die. Their final moments play out like the finest piece of theatre, every detail emblazoned like poetry on my white-hot mind. The same disbelief Maris so eloquently projected from his chiselled face is mirrored back from each of theirs. It's so beautiful I could weep. I look down at my frozen genitals and for the first time lament the passing of my flesh and blood form. A moment of self-love, of languid masturbation, would have been the perfect accompaniment to this performance. Ah well. With difficulty, I manage to get back to my feet. For a moment I forget where I am, what I'm doing, what I've become. The passage of time is something I'm now only vaguely aware of. I remember that I used to parcel it up in an arbitrary way, something called a minute, another larger thing called an hour. Perhaps I had sat there for a minute hour, or a month day, before I remember what I have neglected. A shock of panic almost overwhelms me, and I remember the retreating form of Lydia bounding inexpertly across the lunar surface. A quick glance at the stars tells me the truth of things. Barely 10 minutes in the old currency have passed. She couldn't have gotten far. Lydia is in the far distance, stumbling along in a clumsy tussle with gravity. Her movements betray her panic, the pristine white of her suit already blemished with grey dust from frequent falls. My goodness, she's a brave one. I almost feel a pang of regret for what I did earlier, the 2 hours I spent thoroughly destroying the main lift engines of the lifter module. You're not going anywhere, Princess. My jaw snaps under the strain of my grin and floats forlornly to the ground. If I wasn't already technically dead, I might have died from laughter seeing that old bone lurching free of my body. I eventually find Lydia 2 kilometers south of the destroyed lifter. She's just about given up, poor thing. Her oxygen must be low, but seeing me taking a lazy stroll across the valley in my birthday suit seems to engender a final spurt of exhausted motion. I shake my head like a proud parent and walk patiently on behind her. Another kilometre on, I find her hiding behind a large boulder, though any remaining strength has long since departed her petite form. I try to smile reassuringly, but I don't think that helps. She's as helpless as a babe as I take her in my arms and walk her back to where the electric trolley still waits. I think fleetingly of Commander Maris, now a naked corpse beside his empty suit. I hope he can see me from where he lies dead in the dust. This is what a true hero looks like, pal. The solar panels have charged the cells to capacity, but we only need travel 8 more kilometers to the crater. She alone deserves to witness my discovery. It turns out that she's made of the same tough stuff as me, a real keeper as my mother would have said. As a gesture of goodwill, I top up her oxygen to keep her going a bit longer and smile reassuringly with my frozen mask of a face. Who'd have thought a lowly geologist would make such a wonderful nurse? An hour or so later, I'm carrying her up the shallow slope of the crater. Though her glazed eyes communicate nothing more than her catatonic state, I can still feel the burgeoning admiration she has for me. I think she's just too shy to show it. I gently lay her body down and wait with bated breath for the appearance of the shadow that's somehow blacker than the sky. At last Lydia's eyes swivel in her skull. She's seen it now, uncoiling itself from its repose. Her eyes widen as it glides closer, her lips forming words only her delicate ears can register in her bubble of air. But I can imagine what she is saying. Words of love need little interpretation. Carefully, almost reverently, I pluck the locking pins one by one from her helmet and release the clasp. As her screams are silenced by the cold press of space, I gaze admiringly from above. Her face is all the more beautiful now that it is bathed in hard vacuum, her eyes all the more delightful now that they begin to boil in the crucible of her skull. Her mouth opens grudgingly as the glistening black tendrils part her lips, and then its sizable bulk fills her throat to the brim. I tear my gaze away from the beautiful scene unfolding beneath me and look instead to the cold stars above. Though they are in numbers beyond counting, I begin to tally them one by one, like rock samples in a great velvet tray. When the frozen slush of Lydia's blood drifts across me, I let it play within the gaping maw of my destroyed mouth. At last, we are as one.